You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Labor Day savings are happening right now at the Home Depot. So what are you working on? Prep for fall with our wide selection of cordless power tools that make it easy to clear your lawn starting at $79. And once the leaves are clear, keep your yard looking fresh with colorful mums that bloom all season long. Shop Labor Day savings now through September 3rd, only at the Home Depot. See select stores for details.
In the autumn of 1844, a young, well-dressed man is in the thick of political excitement and a little more. He was just 15. He had aligned himself with the Whig Party that championed economic modernization. And at least in this part of the country where he was, the North, that party opposed the expansion of slavery. He was too young to vote, but alongside his fellow young Whigs, he eagerly participated in the building of an ash pole, a tall wooden structure meant to stand as a symbol of their unwavering support for Henry Clay's presidential bids. Andrew Jackson had his hickory poles, so the Whigs would raise ash poles. A very public, a very showy act. There would have been songs, dances, and music on this day when Arthur and his friends did this. But there's two sides in politics, especially in New York State at this time, with the events taking place. It was a political battleground between Democrats and Whigs, so this poll-raising group drew attention, and soon a group of adolescents with differing political views arrived, sneering at their handiwork. What began as a verbal dispute quickly escalates into a full-fledged brawl. The man found himself in the midst of a fray, fists swinging, his voice lost in the shouts and the scuffles of the young men. Dust kicked around them as they wrestled in the dirt. And one of these brawlers was the future 21st President of the United States, Chester Alan Arthur. But it's doubtful that anybody would have suspected this at the time, especially because even as an adult, such a role for him was surprising to people. And while little specific details of this event are known, we know that it happened. And we can imagine that it was a chaotic scene with torn shirts, bruised faces, dusty clothes. But it subsides, and neither political side could claim total victory on that day, but Arthur emerged with a deeper sense of what it meant to stand by one's convictions, and that politics meant taking a few punches. How do we know this? Because decades later, as President of the United States, Arthur would recall that brawl with a wry chuckle. I have been in many a political battle since then, but none livelier, and none that more thoroughly enlisted me. Chester Arthur, who had become the subject of many political brawls, a few even involving a little roughness, but mostly nonviolent, was born in 1829 in Fairfield, Vermont. His mother was Malvina Stone, his father William Arthur. And indeed, his birth would later become a political issue in and of itself. We'll speak of that in a bit. Malvina, his mother, was of English and Welsh descent, and had a grandfather who served in the Continental Army. But his father was a Scots-Irish immigrant from Ireland, who initially studied law, but became a free will Baptist minister. And emphasis on that free will. He was an outspoken abolitionist. As is covered in the book Gentleman Boss by Thomas C. Reeves. The best book if you're going to look into Arthur. There's not many. Elder Arthur, as William was called, not infrequently shocked and irritated his own parishioners. He was of medium size, dark hair, with a keen, penetrating eye, a colleague recalled, an articulate, witty, passionate man whose sarcasms, when used, were cutting. His thick Irish accent, hot temper, and argumentative spirit left indelible impressions wherever he went. William Arthur did not suffer fools or sinners well. His students often lived in terror of him. Compounding his difficulties with deacons and trustees was the fact that Elder Arthur was an abolitionist. Yeah, Dad caused a lot of moving for the Arthur family, but it was for a righteous purpose. The Arthurs moved through various towns in Vermont and upstate New York before settling in the Schenectady area in 1844. And the Arthur siblings, Chester Arthur had siblings, are raised in a household shaped by their father's role. Several of them established connections in business and journalism and education. They're active people, the Arthurs. Father, William Arthur, as we said, he's a Free Will Baptist minister, traveling around. He's born in Antrim, Ireland. He immigrates to Canada as a young man. He intends to study law. But he also was a scholar and an educator and produces a book, The Etymology of English Words. Really, English family names is what he particularly researched. William Arthur becomes a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1843. This is after Arthur's born. So this is where politics come in, because later political opponents fueled rumors that Chester Arthur was ineligible for the office he later held, the presidency, claiming he had been born outside the United States. It'll be an issue in the 1880 election, and some will tar him. Arthur wouldn't live to see his son reach the vice presidency or the presidency. He would see his son reach some important offices, though, be next to some important people. After all, he had secured them and moved to a town where they'd get a good education. He had hoped that his son would enroll, and indeed he did, in the Union College, nearby the town they settled in. Chester Arthur was intelligent, but not particularly a diligent student. He was kind of known as a socialite and a prankster, good-looking, fashionably long hair, and he sometimes wore a green coat to show support for the Fenian movement, an Irish nationalist organization. Here's from Thomas C. Reeves' book. In an era of virtual laissez-faire on campus, the daily schedule of a Union College student in the late 1840s sounds a little tedious. It began at 6:30 a.m. with breakfast and prayers, ground through a number of study sessions and recitations, concluded with a final period of study that began at 7 p.m. Few escaped, for almost all juniors and seniors, including Arthur, were compelled to live on campus and forbidden to leave without permission. But here's the thing, because you'll often see, if you hear anything about Chester Arthur's early life, they'll pick up on this and say, well, he wasn't a very good student, he was a prankster. But here's what Reeves says. Everyone says the same thing about Arthur that they're going to say his entire life, regardless what they think of him, his politics, etc. He's an affable man. He's a friendly man. He's even a bit sentimental at times. And he found time to join a social fraternity and serve as president of a debating society. And he taught school during 2 winter vacations in a town nearby to help pay his expenses. In various campus societies, he honed his network skills and established friendships that would serve him throughout his political career. After briefly teaching, Arthur studied law in the office of Erastus Culver. Now, Culver is a staunch abolitionist. I'm sure his father approved with that. Culver's firm was rumored to have connections to the Underground Railroad, which means it probably did. In 1854, Arthur was admitted to the bar in New York, became a partner in the firm. It was called now Culver, Parker, and Arthur. And his first significant case comes in 1852. It involves a big national issue. He insists in the defense of 8 enslaved people who were in New York City. This case would almost start a war between the states years before it really started. What happens is, and you kind of have to understand how slavery works when you have free and slave states. It's New York City. And a couple, the Lemons, bring 8 enslaved people and keep them at the boarding house. But New York's a free state. So a free African-American man sees this and is disgusted that, in a sense, people in this free state are being held in captivity. He reports it to a judge and says these people are being kidnapped. New York doesn't recognize there's any bond between these people. And the judge rules in favor of a habeas corpus petition. that they must be released. The South is outraged. The governor of Georgia calls it a case for war. Southern businessmen threaten reprisals against New York, against the customs house. We're going to stop shipping anything through there. See how you survive. Many New Yorkers hate this case for this reason. They're not all like Culver or Arthur's father, especially the businessmen who profit handsomely from commercial ties to the South. The conservative Courier and Journal warned that this issue would do more to separate the North and South than any other event. In fact, businessmen in New York quickly raised $5,000 to compensate, not the slaves, the slave owners. The Virginia legislature, even given this thing that the New York businessmen do, they don't care. They order the state attorney general to employ counsel and file suit and get the people who were enslaved back to Virginia. The New York legislature responds and appoints 3 attorneys to represent them now in the case. One of these attorneys that New York State hires is Edgar Culver. And Culver has been elected a judge, so he's quite busy. So much of the work is going to Arthur. And they hire William Evarts, who will later have cabinet positions, to argue the case before the Supreme Court. But Arthur will have involvement. And his law firm is on the winning side because in both 1857 and 1860, when these cases are heard after a delay, the New York courts uphold the case, uphold the decision of the local judge in the case. Arthur was also involved directly in a landmark case for civil rights. In 1854, Elizabeth Jennings, a black schoolteacher, was forcibly removed from a whites-only streetcar in New York City. Chester Arthur takes the case. He cites a section of the revised statutes of New York that held that common carriers were liable for discrimination and liable for anything that happens to their passengers, including Jennings. So she was forcibly removed. Read into that, she was roughed up a bit by security. So she's seeking damages, and the jury rules in Jennings' favor. Awards her damages. Maybe not as much as she wanted, Arthur wanted. They wanted $500, they got about $200. But it's realized that the Third Avenue Railroad Company has no case because of those revised statutes. And Miss Jennings and Arthur win the suit, and all New York City railroad companies after that integrate their cars. The African American Mutual Aid Society in New York, those societies, celebrate the anniversary of the day of this decision, this case in which Arthur represented Jennings, for years to come. We don't hear about it a lot, but then again, we don't hear about Arthur a lot, do we? At the same time his law career is developing, Chester Arthur's political career is developing. So let's just check in here. He casts his first presidential vote for Winfield Scott in 1852. That's when he's 22. And he joins the new Republican Party when he's 26. The creation of this new party, when Republicanism hits New York. Remember, you have the Kansas-Nebraska decision, legislation, it's very unpopular. Republican Party starts, and initially it's different groups of disparate people, but it starts becoming under one banner, the Republican banner. It's a good opportunity for young people, and Chester Arthur's right in the thick of it. He's a very young and diligent lawyer. He's not a prosperous lawyer yet, but very attentive and a good networker. He's rising up fast. And even though things are different back then, we're talking about a 26-year-old. He's ingratiating himself with the powerful political machine of Thurlow Weed. And this is important for later in our story, later in what's going to be a 3-part series here, that he's also noticing that Thurlow Weed has what can only be described as a political machine. And it's not like Arthur wants to cross Weed. It's not like he's going to be a rebel. He's a networker. But he notices it. You don't want to get on the wrong side of Thurlow Weed, editor and politician, controlling Whig politics in New York at this time. And he takes note in diaries and comments to friends that, everything in New York is at this fellow's beck and call. It's a political machine. It's a dictatorship of sorts. But he makes a decision at 26-year-old to align himself with this Weed faction. Here's what a Boston Herald interview of Chester Arthur says. The Whig Party was at one time under the absolute rule in the state of Mr. Weed. The tactics were simple but effective. If their opponents were superior in numbers, as in respectability, it was custom to station heelers in the line of voters, and these fellows would at a signal break up the lines. On occasion, the ruffians might employ an awl and prod it into the flesh of those where there were too many voters, thus disturbing and dispersing them. Ballot boxes were stuffed almost all the time, in the open. This is Chester Arthur speaking about it. We've heard the same type of stories about Baltimore and other cities in early America at this time, so it's not like it was only New York or Weed. Weed was a staunch defender of the spoils system. He didn't like Andrew Jackson, but this tactic of replacing people once you get the office, that was Weed as well. Rotation in office was fair and democratic. All of these things make an impression on Arthur. And you can draw a line from Thurlow Weed to Ulysses Grant to Conkling. That's right where he is. What we call the stalwart political machine in Republican politics in New York. At the same time, he meets his future wife, Nellie Herndon, but he faces several obstacles here. She's a Southerner from a slave-owning family. Her father, Commander William Lewis Herndon, was a distinguished naval officer. He's a Mexican-American war veteran. He's a renowned American explorer, too. And Nels is an only child, cherished by her parents. It made approval for a marriage unlikely, especially given Arthur's lack of money and his father's reputation as an abolitionist preacher. How's this all going to happen? Well, a couple of events come together, and it comes from Arthur going on a long trip and then a disaster happening. In the middle of the 1850s, Henry Ward Beecher, the famous pastor at Brooklyn's Plymouth Congregational Church, is urging this cause. Soldiers, in quotes, need to pick up Sharp's rifles and fight, settle Kansas, settle the new territory created with that dreaded Kansas-Nebraska Act. They know Nebraska is going to be a free state just because of the people who will tend to live there. But Kansas borders Missouri, and if more slave state people go move there, it will itself become a slave territory and a slave state. Not if Northerners move. And so there's this movement. Make this free area. Prevent slave owners from settling Missouri up. Northerners are arriving from Massachusetts, other places. John Brown's already leading attacks and counterattacks between free and slave groups. In the New York election campaign of 1856, Republican orator George William Curtis will have his long speech. And he declares, "The no victim of these revolutionary days sleeping under the green sod is more truly a martyr of liberty than every murdered man whose bones lie bleeding in the summer sun upon the silent plains of Kansas." Bleeding Kansas. Arthur swept up in this. But he's not just swept up in rhetoric. It's not just about being a martyr of liberty. There's a potential to make a ton of money in land as this new area gets settled. There's an article by Dr. Edward Bumgardner from the 1930s that shows up an account of Arthur's time in Lawrence, Kansas. He talks about how Chester Arthur visited their town 80 years ago. Lawrence, Kansas entertained unawares a man who was to become the President of the United States. The future president not only visited Lawrence with a view to locating there, but he actually practiced law in Douglas County for one day. Early in the summer of 1857, Chester Arthur, a young lawyer from New York City, accompanied by his partner, Henry D. Gardner, came to Kansas to settle and grow up in the country, entering the territory by crossing the Missouri at St. Joseph's. They came down to the west side of the river to Leavenworth, where they remained and investigated conditions there for several days. And they were favorably impressed. They bought between 200 and 300 town lots and felt inclined to cast their own lot there, to live there. But before deciding this, Arthur wanted to decide, he wanted to see other towns in Kansas, not just Leavenworth. So he comes to Lawrence after Arthur would assume the presidency, he tells a reporter the story. In fact, it's a Kansas reporter. Mr. Arthur's ride through the Delaware Reservation and stage bound for Lawrence was a bright spot in his memory. Nature had been so kind to Kansas. He was pleased with the new country. Talking about the fertile land, you're talking about the climate, you're talking about the farms that are blossoming. But he was disturbed by the unsettled political conditions and the belligerent attitude of men. At Lawrence, which is a settlement of northern people, he meets General Lane, who had introduced him to Sam Walker, the governor of the state, the celebrated Sheriff Walker, who became governor. Arthur said of him, "I always liked Walker very much indeed. I think he was the man that most impressed me of all the men I talked to at the time." The temper of the Lawrence people was not reassuring for Arthur to stay here a long time, and he determined to interview the governor regarding the political situation, the territory, find out what's going on. So early one morning he started from Lawrence to Lecompton, where the territorial capital was, on horseback. And when he traveled about half the distance, he was overtaken by General Lane and Wood, who were going on an errand to the capital. To Lane's astonishment, Arthur's unarmed. Well, of course Arthur's unarmed. He wasn't somebody that would normally carry New York City person. Not really someone who would carry weapons. General Lane asks him, "Chester, where is your revolver?" Arthur said he didn't have one. Oh, no. Lane then proceeds to give him a severe lecture on the folly of a northern man going to the pro-slavery capital unarmed. And he insists that he takes the loan of one of his revolvers, as he had two. Arthur took the gun, but he never had any experience with such a tool, didn't know what to do with it. He was more nervous during the rest of the day, he said, than he would have been without it. But upon arriving to Lecompton, Arthur immediately seeks out the governor. He learned that the executive mansion was a story-and-a-half frame house, having 2 rooms downstairs, 1 room upstairs, which the governor had his office. The entry to the office was gained by going up an outside stairway made of cottonwood boards and through an anteroom, in which were stored a pile of corn, some empty boxes, and a collection of saddles. Pretty far from New York City. And right there is the room where the governor sits at a round table. Walker talked to him. He had taken up his duties at Lecompton about 2 months before. He considered Lawrence to be the trouble, the hotbed of all the abolitionist movements. But even though he felt that way, he had also offended the pro-slavery side in his efforts to be fair to free state settlers. He couldn't win. He was already distrusted and denounced by everyone. Having so many troubles of his own mind, he could not recommend Kansas to Arthur. No, it's not a placid community to go live in. As an illustration of the turmoil in the territory, a man named Bailey had been killed in Lecompton the night before. In fact, Walker presents such a gloomy picture of conditions in the territory that Arthur has no enthusiasm left for Kansas. Leaving the governor's office, he went to the hotel for a dinner. A man sitting at the same table and conversing with him was suddenly arrested by a deputy sheriff and charged with the murder of that man Bailey. Fortunately for him, in their conversation, he had learned that Arthur was a lawyer, and then he insists on Arthur going to court to defend him. Arthur hesitates at first, but finally went with the prisoner and secured bail for him. Thus, Chester Arthur did practice law in Kansas. But that was enough for him. He went back to Leavenworth, he took a steamer to Omaha, and he was soon back in New York City. He never saw Kansas again. But as this reporter writes, according to the standards of that time, he was a citizen for about a month. And in September 1857, Arthur returns to New York. If you're like me, I can't think when things aren't clean and tidy around me, That's why HomeAglow is great. HomeAglow is a top-rated home service platform. It has online booking capabilities that allow you to instantly schedule a cleaner who works in your area for a special occasion, for a party, or how about this? To just come in on a regular basis and clean things up. All cleaners pass a rigorous certification process and maintain a 4.8 star average platform rating. Now, HomeAglow is sponsoring this episode of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, and we thank them. To schedule a cleaning, you go to HomeAglow's website, you choose the day and time you're looking for and the duration of your cleaning, and you match with a cleaner. You can schedule it as quickly as this week, or you can get something on the calendar for next month or check it off your to-do list early. The best part is their Forever Clean membership, which saves you $30 an hour on all future cleanings. You can book unlimited cleaning starting at $19 per hour, backed by HomeAglow's Happiness Guarantee. Now, take home cleaning off your plate this summer by using HomeAglow. Head to homeaglow.com/myhist, MYHIST, myhist, to get your first 3 hours of cleaning for only $19. That's HomeAglow.com/myhist. He's empty-handed. He didn't really make that much money. There's no job. There's no law practice. Seemingly desperate, this isn't going to impress Nellie Herndon's family at all. But fate intervenes, and he doesn't so much have to. Captain Herndon, commanding the USS Central America, perishes at sea when a storm sinks the ship. The ship that the captain is in charge of is transferring an important shipment of gold from California to United States reserves, and the sinking of it will actually cause a financial panic. It'll be one of the factors that causes the financial panic in 57. But for Arthur, never want to celebrate somebody's death like that, but it's a bit of a blessing for his situation, because the family now is distraught, the mother's distraught, the daughter's distraught. And here is this young lawyer who can help manage his affairs, manage his estate, go to court and represent them. He has the license. He's diligent. He's good. And what Arthur starts to learn is the fact that he came back from Kansas. For a lot of people who hadn't been to that bloody state that they're hearing so much about, there was a mark of some regret, of some respect for him. In 1858, Chester Arthur takes a 2-week visit to Fredericksburg, Virginia, to meet members of the Herndon and Hansborough families. This is his first trip down south, and he probably thought about the impression that it would make upon Nell's relatives, the slave owners. In fact, Miss Herndon and her daughter were frequently served by at least one family slave. Dr. Brodie Herndon, Nell's uncle, was a large, handsomely dressed, soft-spoken man with a quick smile and a humorous story. He was fond of quoting large passages from Burns. So was Arthur, and Arthur knew enough Latin and Greek to converse with Herndon. Moreover, Arthur was an established attorney and had been entrusted with Mrs. Herndon's weighty bookkeeping. Nell's family took to him immediately. Dr. Herndon wrote in his diary, "He's a fine-looking man, and we all like him very much." The Arthurs were married on October 25th, 1859, in New York City's Calvary Episcopal Church. They soon moved into Miss Herndon's home on 34 West 24th Street and remained there until the Civil War broke out. During this time, something quite grand happens to Chester Arthur, and that is that he had joined the New York State Militia, and he'd been commissioned judge advocate of the 2nd Brigade. It doesn't really pay that much. It's just kind of a volunteer position that young lawyers will take in order to make political connections. But a person that spots him is the governor of the state, Edwin Morgan. Edwin Morgan is a big figure. He had been national chairman of the Republican Party. And that's a big position. He put himself on there. He'd been a New York alderman. He'd been a state senator in New York. And Thurlow Weed rewards Morgan with the governorship of the state. He's a hardworking guy. He puts in 16-hour days, goes through a lot of aids, and he expects the people under him to work 19-hour days. He finds this young man who come back from Kansas, not a bad thing, in the Republican Party, and hires him as engineer-in-chief. So he has now secured in his 20s a top position on the New York governor's staff. And at 30, when Civil War breaks out, Arthur is very well positioned. And so at 30, Chester Arthur has secured a spot on the New York governor's staff. And this is right as the Civil War breaks out. Arthur is very well positioned. Lincoln asks the states for 75,000 men. And first of all, Lincoln thinks that's going to be enough. It's not going to be. And New Yorkers are to supply about 30,000 of these troops he's requested to make that happen. You can't just snap your fingers. There's a lot of work to recruiting troops at this time. So Edwin Morgan asks Arthur and others at this point to make this recruitment happen. And so, you probably didn't know it, but Arthur has a role in the Civil War. Now, it's not on the front. He's only recorded to have gone to the battlefront at one time. He's in New York State, and there was no fighting directly in New York State. It's a desk job of sorts. Not in the line of fire, but very, very important. It's a demanding logistics job. It requires know-how, smarts, and leadership. And indeed, everything he learned in the law and learned in the wild territory in Kansas, he's using in his next job. And the governor is quite pleased with him. It's not easy turning civilians into troops, and it's not something that had been in New York in a long time. It's not something the state had to do since the War of 1812. So housing the swelling number of troops, New York City is a nightmare of logistics. Initial accommodations were found in volunteer buildings. That's when they thought this might be a 30-day thing. Then the Union Army is defeated in Bull Run. It looks like it's going to be a long war. Under Arthur's supervision, temporary barracks are constructed on Long Island, Staten Island, Rikers Island, Central Park. By July 12th, New York had raised, equipped, and dispatched 38 regiments to the battlefield. A regiment in the Civil War time is going to be about 1,000 people, sometimes less, though. Lincoln had predicted that he needed 75,000 men to put down the rebellion. That's not going to work. By the end of December 1861, New York alone, just this state, had enrolled over 110,000 men in the Union Army. And from his office on the second floor, Chester Arthur managed an overwhelming amount of paperwork, handling complex duties, awarding contracts for military uniforms and expenditures. By 1862, he'll be promoted to Quartermaster General of New York. He had to become an expert in everything, from stockings to blankets to ammunition. No matter how small the matter, he'd be running out to A.T. Stewart's to get some socks for a local regiment. With the War Department desperate for manpower, and by the time you get in 1862, Quartermaster General Arthur is taxed not only with legitimate requests from the government, but many opportunists are now flooding to Washington, getting commissions one way or the other, their favors perhaps, and then coming to New York to now commission in hand raise their own regiments. This was a little misguided, scattered, and these self-appointed colonels often gathered subordinates who then paid for their commissions, printed their own handbills, and then they attempted to assemble troops. At one point, nearly 100 such groups operated in New York alone, a nightmare to manage all of these commissions. Groups didn't always have the full quota. In fact, they rarely did. And they weren't well drilled if they were drilled at all. Some of them would have no intention of going anywhere near the battlefield, anywhere near the South. They'd occupy buildings on city blocks and act, or hang out in clubs and act as if they were local gangs, because some of them were. And who was to stop them? They had their commission. They were part of the Union war effort. Some of them had all the insignias and everything like that. So Arthur had to intervene repeatedly to maintain order and legitimacy. One of the most notorious cases involved Billy Wilson, who was an alderman from New York City. He was in the most crime-ridden district. That's because Wilson recruited the people who were doing the crime, a gang of toughs, and made a regiment. Most of these weren't going to fight anyone, at least an enemy. They were looting restaurants while still in uniform. And the police in New York were hesitant to do anything because, well, they're the army. And Billy Wilson had local influence. So they largely allowed this chaos to continue. Desperate business owners appealed to the state, and Governor Morgan puts Chester Arthur in charge of solving the problem. Arthur issues an order for Wilson to stop. And Wilson swaggers into Chester Arthur's office in full uniform. When challenged about his authority, he says, "Neither you nor the governor, Mr. Arthur, has anything to do with me. I'm a colonel in the United States service." Arthur's unfazed. You have to remember, Arthur, from all the descriptions, he's a tall man. He's a strong man as a young man. Not the, Arthur that we see in the presidential pictures when he's older and Bright's disease started to hit. Now, we have a very different image than we should have of this younger Chester Arthur. So he replies to Wilson, "You are not a colonel, and you will not be a colonel until you have raised your regiment to its full quota and received your final commission." Wilson then scoffs and says, "Well, I've got my shoulder straps anyway, and as long as I wear them, I'll take no orders from you." And without hesitation, Arthur steps forward, rips the straps off Wilson's uniform, throws him into a chair, and says, "You're under arrest." As quartermaster general, Arthur outranked him. Wilson wouldn't be the only one he'd have to deal with. There was another fellow, R.W. Goodwin, who was raising troops for the so-called President's Lifeguard. Well, that sounds very good. They're going to protect good old Abe Lincoln. Right. Except, all they were doing was occupying a piece of Staten Island in New York City. Lincoln's not there, and they don't have anyone's permission to be there. Arthur warns Goodwin that he's occupying land needed for real regiments, and he and his men will be forcibly removed, even if it meant mobilizing 500 troops to kick him out. Goodwin and their men eat a meal and promptly fled. But Goodwin would then take to newspapers, accusing Quartermaster General Arthur of corruption, claiming he did nothing without being bribed in gold and silver. This was an early taste of the kind of attacks would be made to Arthur, who legitimately did do a lot of politicking. But was never, at least that could be proven, directly corrupt like that. Another group Arthur had to manage was the Fire Zouaves. Now, this was a little different situation from the first two. The Fire Zouaves were a legitimate unit. And Zouaves, by the way, were French regiments that were very brightly colored and beautifully uniformed. And it was very popular at the beginning of the war, until people started to realize that maybe wearing all these bright colors is not so good in the woods when people are taking shots at you. But in the beginning, Zouaves were all the rage, the legacy of the Crimean War. The Fire Zouaves were recruited by Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, and he's got good intentions. He's a friend of Abraham Lincoln. And on paper and on the streets, the Fire Zouaves looked great, well-funded. They had their uniforms. They were made up of New York City firemen. They paraded around the street in their uniforms. But their discipline was questionable. And Colonel Ellsworth actually starts complaining he can't control them. They're not listening to his orders. When he tells them to unpack their muskets, they won't do it. Ellsworth turns to Arthur for help. Arthur gets on it right away and marches into the Canal Street headquarters of the Fire Zouaves with a contingent of police and starts pointing at the ringleaders, the subordinates who were causing all the trouble and lack of discipline. Arrest that man. Arrest that one. Order was swiftly restored, and eventually the Fire Zouaves are deployed to Washington, D.C. But once there, the story doesn't end. The Fire Zouaves wreaked havoc on the town for 2 days. Wreaked havoc on the town for 2 days. They rampaged through D.C. They broke into taverns. They terrified elderly residents. And they ordered extravagant meals on credit. When asked whose name the meal was under, who to be billed to, they would say, "Charge it to Jefferson Davis." The Army had enough. And the regiments actually sent back to New York City in shame. Now they're quartered in tents on the Battery on Manhattan Island, and they're not reforming. They continue to defy Colonel Ellsworth's orders, and they start acting like Wilson's guys did. They're going around looting restaurants for food, marching around, acting tough. Arthur's instructed to disband the Fire Zouaves. But he decides instead that just disbanding them wasn't enough. He wants to make sure somebody's helping to contribute to New York's quota here. Somebody's getting sent. They can't all be bad. He orchestrates a mass arrest. He tells the police, anyone you see on the streets, loose people, and Fire Zouaves are not that hard to spot on the street, collect them. And he brings 400 of the men to a ship that sails for Hampton Roads, Virginia. They are merged with another regiment. They are introduced to strict discipline, and many of them fight throughout the Civil War. Beyond handling unruly regiments, Arthur also oversaw the inspection of New York's coastal defenses. The situation wasn't great in 1862. New York didn't have many defenses. They weren't in good order, and they weren't in the right places. The city had outgrown the defenses. Working alongside an engineer's assistant, he submitted to the state of New York an exhaustive report detailing the fortifications and the bad condition of them. Some of these guns will not take out modern ships. It named specific areas where improvement was needed. The New York Herald called it one of the most important and valuable documents presented to our legislature. And it was. And the legislature began to act a little bit on those recommendations, but not fast enough. Until an event happens that nobody expected. The Union had blockaded Confederate ports. The Navy ships doing that were mostly made of wood. And on March 8th, 1862, a mysterious ship that wasn't made of wood but looked like it was made of metal emerges from the water in Hampton Roads. And it unleashes a devastating assault. It destroys the USS Cumberland there to blockade the port. It destroys that ship with its guns, but it also has steel sides and a huge ram in the front, and it simply rams the USS Congress and sets it ablaze. It then severely damages the USS Minnesota. This is not a fair fight. No one can stop this ship. It will damage 5 other ships before it's done. The ship, marked as the CSS Virginia, has got iron plating. It's recognized by the Union Navy because it used to be the USS Mamaroneck, a Union steam frigate that had been burnt and sunk when Union forces abandoned the Navy Yard in Norfolk, Virginia, April 1861. The Confederacy raised the hulk and, under the direction of John Porter and John Mercer Brooke, transformed it into an ironclad with sloped iron armor, 10 guns, and an iron ram. The armor and the way that it slopes makes it virtually impervious to cannon fire. Even if the iron wasn't good enough to stop most cannonballs, which it was for the most part, the sloping of it meant that No one ball can take in all of the iron. It's helps to deflect cannonballs. A projectile hitting a boat or ship like this had a better chance of bouncing off, and the angle meant it was eating more iron and structure than when the armor's vertical. So reports surfaced that through this rebuilt Merrimack, now the Virginia, it was going to destroy more Union frigates. The Navy can't do anything about it, and it's heading right for New York to put the city under siege, to ruin the commerce there, set the city ablaze, take out big ships, make it surrender. God knows what all of these things that could happen are being talked about. And the New York City has no defense. The best defense the leaders had come up with is an absurd plan to swarm the Iron Collar with every available wooden ship they have. We don't have an iron ship, so let's swarm it with scores of wooden ships. Every ferry boat, every tug. Word comes from General McClellan that this isn't going to work. A different defense should be used. And Arthur and his team took swift action to implement the suggestion, bolstering shore batteries in particular places and deploying vessels to the lower bay in anticipation of the Virginia coming. They'll lure it right near where the batteries are if it comes. His system was not tested, fortunately, before disaster could strike. The USS Monitor, a newly designed Union ironclad with a revolutionary rotating turret, arrived and engaged the Virginia in a historic duel. For hours, the two ironclads pounded each other with cannon fire at close range. Neither inflicted serious damage to the other and was a tactical draw, but it showed the future of naval combat. The Virginia remained a threat, but it had limited mobility after this fight. In fact, in May 1862, the former Merrimack, now Virginia, was destroyed in any case. The Confederates were afraid that during some of the Union campaigns it would be taken. Arthur and his colleague, General George Bliss, had worked frantically to implement all of these defensive measures. They could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Bliss would later become a political person in the state of New York and would work with Arthur in the White House. So Arthur's role in managing New York's war effort demonstrated his ability to navigate logistical challenge. By 1862, 219,000 men had been sent from New York to the front lines. And there's one more thing that Arthur does as he's supervising New York regiments. He goes with one of them south right as the Battle of Fredericksburg is starting. And an interviewer in 1932 from the local area said that Arthur had placed a guard around his uncle-in-law's home during the First Battle of Fredericksburg to prevent its destruction. So that's one favor he's able to do for his southern in-laws. From Fredericksburg, he goes with the Army of the Potomac and was touring troops until he's asked by Governor Morgan to return to New York. The battle now was not military, it was political, and he needed Chester Arthur's help. Arthur was a big part of managing Governor Morgan's re-election effort. Now, unfortunately, the Republican cause, that election was lost, and Horatio Seymour becomes governor of New York. He'll be a thorn in the side of Lincoln. He'll tolerate, it's believed, draft riots that occur in 1863 in New York City. But this is to be. Arthur's done pretty well for himself in the Civil War. He's been needed by this powerful governor, seen as a loyal lieutenant, seen as someone who can get things done, who takes care of problems. It's going to get him eventually the highest patronage job in the United States, which oddly enough will put him into the highest elected position in the United States government thereafter. But this concludes where we are. I just want to make 2 points about everything you've heard so far. One is, not only is it an interesting, maybe a charming story about a guy who becomes president, kind of a fluke. Who was he? Arthur's always that. His Majesty comes from obscurity kind of guy, and we don't talk about him much at all. We certainly don't then talk about his childhood. But there's two things to note from all of this. One is that you see his ability to organize. He's got a skill there. Not everyone does. Not everyone can lead a large organization. And you also see that Chester Arthur touches every issue of his time. North and South Civil War, bleeding Kansas, civil rights, education, religion, the Whigs and the Democrats. He's of a time period where Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor and Henry Clay were important people when Lincoln's running. And we're going to see that continue through the rest of his life. He may not be always the front person, but he's usually central in the events that are going on in American history in the 19th century. That's what we're going to find out later. I want to thank you for listening.
I'm Chris Stewart, and I invite you to come and join us here at the History of China podcast. We've got it all. Wars with millions on each side to help drive home exactly why you should never get involved in a land war in Asia. Come along on the Silk Road to partake in its riches. Join the great Khans of the steppes on campaign. Ply the seas on treasure ships. Or strike out with pirate crews to take their riches for your own. Experience the sumptuousness of the imperial court behind the guarded gates of the Forbidden City. All this and so much more here at the History of China podcast.